We have now returned from recess. Senator Torres, you had questions you wanted to ask, ma'am?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's been a very interesting discussion about this bill that would authorize the bond borrowing for the additional cell at Luzon. And in listening to everybody and in looking at the bill itself, it contemplates that GSWA doesn't have the credit history, and so what would otherwise be structured as a revenue bond is now being proposed as a general obligation bond, but it in essence operates as a revenue bond. I noticed too that there are a lot of boilerplate assurances that are built into this bill to make it more attractive to the bond borrowers. You know, specifically like in page 9, under subsection K, there's authorization for credit enhancement. And then further on page 11, there's alternate authority for a loan should they not secure the $30 million. But I was just wondering though, to Gita, and I know that there are all these measures that are in place to make it more attractive to the bond market, but what is the climate presently for bond borrowing for the government of Guam? And in your opinion, do you think that it's likely that we would have to resort to subsection K, for example, on page 9 or 11? Or are those more assurances and not really a big likelihood that we would have to exercise those? In your opinion, are we secure enough that those are just nice to haves?
Ms. Mendiola?
So specific to subsection K, authorization for credit enhancement, this of course improves the marketability of a bond, and by leaving it in, what you have is a situation wherein if you need something to enhance your credit, such as bond insurance, you have the ability to go out and get it, and that would then result in our bonds selling at a premium, which would then result in a lower yield to us, lower interest rate to us, a cheaper borrowing situation. And yes, to speak to the environment for government of Guam credit, we are in a situation where we continue to maintain our triple tax exempt status, which is a very good thing. There's also, bonds operate on a supply and demand type of curve, and right now the supply of triple tax exempt bonds does not quite meet the demand. But there is some discussion about the municipal market starting to soften in the coming years, and so I think time is certainly of the essence with regard to issuing this particular issuance.
And I suppose what would make this a true revenue bond is if we could appropriate sufficient revenues from the GSWA revenue stream to cure the principal and interest of the bond issued pursuant to subsection F on page 7. So the true test of whether this can function as a revenue bond, although it is being issued as a general obligation bond, where the government is guaranteeing, the only way to ensure that it really serves as functions as a revenue bond is if the lien can in fact be sufficient to where we appropriate sufficient revenues from GSWA to service both the principal and interest, correct? And so that would be the primary objective.
I don't think I understand the question, if you wouldn't mind, but I can go through subsection F, which is the appropriation of revenues. All revenues are hereby appropriated for the purpose of paying the principal and interest on the bonds issued pursuant to this section. So all revenues implies the general obligation nature of this bond, in that it doesn't say pledged revenues of GSWA.
That's the part that I think that's where many of us are having pause, is because there's so many assurances that the government of Guam is is going to guarantee, although in reading this, it implies that the first lien is on the revenue proceeds from GSWA. But without some assurance on subsection F that the revenues are to be in an amount sufficient to cover that from GWSA, it almost is an automatic default to the government general funds, and that's the part it's a little unsettling because it's such a good bill in that it's very favorable to the lender, the way that it's written. You know, there are a lot of assurances to the lender that the debt will be serviced by the government revenues and backed up by the government revenues. But I suppose what would be more reassuring is if we could guarantee that first and foremost the revenue stream is going to be the GSWA proceeds and not the general fund monies. And that's what I'm getting at is there a way that you know, we can be assured after the fact that that is in fact the case? That the first lien is not necessarily on the government's money, but on the revenues from GSWA.
Yeah, I think it's a very unique, borrowing that's being requested. And to your question regarding ensuring that the first dollar goes to pay the first dollar of debt service payment is from solid waste revenues. I think Lester had alluded to it, or actually mentioned it a little earlier, is that the solid waste revenues, the pledge doesn't necessarily make the type of bond. So actually subsection F, the appropriation of revenues of all revenues of the government, makes this the general obligation bond. And the intent is really for solid waste tipping fees to be the pledged revenue, and if at such time that is not sufficient, then obviously the general fund would pick up. But the intent really is, and that's why it makes it unique, is that solid waste tipping fees is the pledged revenues to pay back the debt service. But in the event that may not happen, subsection F really is the section that makes this a general obligation bond.
And the reason that I brought that up, and I understand the discussion that's happened over the several hours we've been here, but what I'm thinking about is, in practical sense, when we get down to the budget process and the Budget Act, how does this translate in terms of the set-aside that we normally do at the top, where we set aside all the monies for bond repayment and then divvy up the rest? You know, how does this factor in then? Because this would imply that there has to be a guarantee or a set aside and then some sort of reimbursement mechanism in place. And that's the part that, you know, when you think about it starting out in the Budget Act, it's a very awkward situation. And is that going to, in fact, be what happens in your estimate, and anyone from the panel, when it comes to assuring that this, in the bond process, I mean in the Budget Act, is it taken off the top like everything else, since it's the GO bond, with a repayment mechanism? And how does the lien come into place, the first lien, the second lien, the guarantee?
Go ahead, Lester.
Thank you, Senator. I'll be working hand in hand with my primo over here to ensure that in the construction of the 2020 budget that we do recognize the general obligation bond. And then what we did before, when we did have reimbursements from the receiver, we went ahead and appropriated from the reimbursement. So we would pay the debt service on the 2009 bonds, and then the expected reimbursement would be appropriated. In this case, we will recognize the debt, and then we will identify underneath that the full debt service will be paid by GSWA, so that the government of Guam recognizes the debt, but we're not appropriating the money to pay for it.
Right, okay. That
Okay.
makes sense. Yeah, the mechanics of it is just very strange, and I appreciate that you're trying to walk us through it.
Thank you. Speaker Barnes. Ma'am.
Si Jules Masi, Mr. Chair, for giving me the opportunity to speak and maybe ask a couple of questions. I'd like to maybe pose a couple of questions. The first one would be, earlier we talked about the timeline of how fast, if this measure was passed, how fast we could get the bond facilitated through and into the market, and it was looked at a couple of months, am I right?
Yes, that's correct, Speaker.
So my question would be to you folks, the likability of the bonds going out into the market, how fast do you think, or are there interested bidders out there to look at this proposal?
We were looking at money in the bank by the end of July.
By the end of July?
That's correct.
Wow, okay. So with that being said,
It's new sheriff in town, Speaker.
say that again?
I said new sheriff in town, Speaker.
Thank you. The question that was asked earlier, but I think by the good senator of Tumuning, was maybe the question about the rate increase if we were to go through this process. And you noted on page 5 the GSWA's financial projection analysis that based on the projected financial statements for fiscal years 2020 to 2024, which the receiver is said to be reasonable, the governor believes that based on the pay-as-you-go plan to fund the PCTF, in addition to the borrowing of the $30 million for Ladson Landfill Cell 3, the GSWA is able to absorb such fund debt service and set-aside amounts without the need to raise increase. If there was a provision placed in the bill that specifically notes this, would there be an effect to this facilitation moving forward? Could it be stated in the bill?
Could it be stated in the bill about the $2 million pay-as-you-go portion?
The fact that there would not be a rate of increase based on this borrowing measure? It was a statement said in court, and I believe it was by Mr. Carlson. Am I right?
Yes.
And so I'm just asking, just to reassure our listening audience, if this provision, based on what was presented to us, if this provision was placed in one of the sections in this bill, would that hamper the facilitation moving forward on the cell?
Not that I'm aware of, Speaker. Nonetheless, the $2 million and the bond payments, as stated in the pro forma, are kind of set. You know, those are set payments. So you can certainly state that these will not directly affect the potential increase in tipping fees or result in an increase in directly result in an increase in tipping fees. Nonetheless, it doesn't speak to revenue and expenses, which we can't speak to in the legislation, in this particular legislation. We can't guarantee revenues, we can't guarantee expenses. We know that the payment will be as is. We know that the $2 million is, as stated. And so those may not directly, those do not directly impact the uncertainty. The question mark is what's going to happen to revenue and what's going to happen to expenses that cannot be predicted, such as personnel and others.
Could I get a thought from the administration, Lester, on that same provision as you stated earlier?
I agree with Mel that the statement is that the debt service and the set aside for ORDOT would not be the cause for a rate increase.
So my question is, if it was stated anywhere in the provision of this,
You
would it affect?
but see, the way that you're prefacing it, it would be global And that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is if expenditures, even though Mr. Gass is dead set on reducing expenditures, increasing efficiencies, we just don't know what's going to happen. And so for us to say absolutely, without unequivocally, that it's not going to cause a rate increase, we can say that for the bottom part, as Mel did. These two components will not drive the rates up. The rates will be driven up by other factors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. This completes the second round of questions. Senator Parrish, you have a motion?
First of all, Mr. Chair, I do want to give some updates regarding the PUC. He is unable to make it. Mr. Fred Harecki was unable to make it today, but he did want to pass along a message, and I want to basically say he understands the constraints that we're under regarding the timeline as far as borrowing is concerned. He says, quote, "The PUC no doubt supports the bond issuance. He realizes it's to have a PUC's review, it would take 30 to 45 days. And regarding the PUC waiver, he says, quote, frankly, he won't be upset either way, given the unique circumstances, and the PUC is leaving it to the discretion of the legislature regarding the waiver. He also says that he is working with Guam Solid Waste Authority in undertaking a management audit. And he also states, that down there. Okay. He states that he understands the difficult situation the legislature is in, given the current statutes aren't clear regarding the PUC's role in a partial receivership. Traditionally, and in the absence of a tight timeline, the PUC would continue to advocate further involvement in a borrowing process such as this. And he also further states that if the senators, he welcomes the senators to reach out to his office directly to confirm this, if they wish. And I will supply the numbers to my colleagues. So that, so the bottom line is that they are in support of the bond issuance.
Thank you, Senator. My colleagues, I'd like to excuse the panel at this time.
Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, sorry.
We did the second round already, so now
Wait.
because we've already completed the 2 rounds. I mean, I wouldn't have had any problem, but
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, if I could ask a few more questions just to follow up on some of the discussion that was made earlier. I did want to follow up with some of the members of the panel on some of those things. It won't take too long. That's mine. I'm not sure if
okay.
there's
How
anyone
many
else.
questions are you looking at? Well, because already, already did the 2 rounds. You're looking at 2 questions?
About 4, Mr.
4?
Chair.
Okay, we'll allow the 4, but I will now clock the 3 minutes on all 4 questions. One time. It's now 6:12. You got until 6:15. Ma'am, continue.
Okay, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask Gita and the rest of the financing team that put this plan together. According to Gita's testimony, there was a financing team, and they list all the members, and many of them are here. If they are expecting any other borrowing, or have they identified any other priority CIP projects to commit our government to general obligation bonds, in other words?
Ms. Minjola, yes or no?
Specific to GSWA, no.
No, not specific, no. Government, because this is a general obligation, so, for the government.
Other than what's already in statute that, will one way or the other work its way out, like Simon Sanchez, things like that, we don't know of any new projects.
So none for the hospital or any others anticipated right now? All right, so, I wanted to follow up on an earlier question that was one of the senators talked about if we commit to this bond. I mean, I had asked, do we commit to the current tipping fees? But did you say that we may be committing to the current tax structure besides BPT, which is committed by another bond, but all of our all the other revenues that you're going to be projecting to the bond, people will we be restricted from changing those?
No.
I wanted to find out from EPA if they agree with this proposal because they weren't part of this financing team, and if they've seen the financing plan of GSWA and that it's based on, you've heard it's based on the revenue, based on collection of trash, and do you agree that this is feasible? Do you foresee any unforeseen environmental costs that's not being projected in their plan? And do you agree that we may be bound? We're going to hear from Gita when they hear back, I guess, that we might be bound by tipping fees or not?
Senator, so again, I have to preface my answer that I'm not a finance expert. I'm not sure. I understand where you're and I'm going to ask this. Are you asking me if this bill in its form is structuring that the tipping fee can't be changed? Can you please clarify that? Is that the question you're asking me, that based on this bill in its form, that the tipping fee can't be changed?
No, we don't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. We've asked Gita that, and but let's say the answer is yes, it cannot be changed, that we are committing to current fees as a minimum, not overall revenue, but fees.
Right.
Yeah, do you agree? Is that consistent with your plans for Guam, the EPA's?
No, for right now, our goal is to try to assist and make the cost for the customers reduced. Now, again, I know that there's numerous answers out there that, well, how are you going to do that? And you increase the customer things that I will work with Guam Solid Waste Authority to try to identify. Me, it's not for customer revenue. Mine is to reduce illegal dump sites. But they both can serve the same purpose of increasing for Guam Solid Waste Authority their clientele, and for me, it's to reduce the illegal dumping. Again, as a simple person as I am and not an economic advisor, if they increase the customers, shouldn't that also allow them to decrease the cost? I would say yes, but I can't say anything as far as this bill being tied into, if it's being tied in that it cannot decrease the cost. I think I need to defer to these guys. I don't personally agree with that, but I'm not the finance officer to be able to say that.
All right.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I wanted to just put on the record that so the GSWA board is not here today, and we're kind of making promises that they're not going to go to PUC and request a rate increase. And so I'm hoping that that's consistent with what they really do believe or promise, right? And they're also not here to confirm whether this, structure is based on increasing trash, right, or not. And I guess I'm concerned because of, our other plans with EPA on that. And then I just finally, because we're following up with Gita on obligations, what are included under obligations, and financing. Yeah, is there any opportunity for other potential savings in the remaining part of the receivership, such as Guam bidding any parts of that out, or reducing the costs that we might be able to use then for part of the financing on the GSWA side?
Mr. Gassi, if you can answer that question, because that's the last question. Do you have an answer?
I think it's
Or is it Gita?
yeah, whoever's handling
Whoever's
Reducing the costs
of the receivership, the part that's going to remain. Are you still in negotiations with anyone at the court, or is that set? Are we able to find potential savings, such as bidding out the closure of the ORDA differently than what the receiver's proposing, or the trustee, or any parts? Because that was part of your original proposal also, that I had read in the newspaper, right, when we were talking about 40 million. And so I just want to know, is there any potential savings that we might see in that remaining part of the receivership?
I think as far as Gita's involvement, it's been primarily financing and finding a good home for the trust account, the $2 million ordered post-closure monies. But as far as the functions of the post-closure functions, in addition to any of the operational functions wherein there might be savings, that was primarily GSWA, and that was primarily between the solid waste, the receiver, EPA, and so I'm not able to answer that.
Oh,
Okay. Thank you. The panels will now be excused. Thank you, gentlemen. Ms. Mendiola, thank you. Okay. You guys take care. Take care. All right. Stay. No. Senator Paris, do you have a motion, ma'am?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make some closing statements first, if that's allowable.
I beg your pardon?
Closing statements?
Yes, you may. Yes, you may, ma'am.
Okay, Susan Masi, thank you, Chairman, thank you, Speaker, my fellow colleagues. This discussion was very fruitful, and I know it's a difficult bill, it's a very complex bill, and I appreciate all the questions and the transparency that we brought to the public today. I know borrowing is a never easy thing, and especially when we're dealing with millions of dollars, we have to be very careful about how we handle the public trust. I just want to highlight a couple points about this bill. The intent of this borrowing is to be paid for by Guam Solid Waste revenues, although it's a general obligation bond. And this is necessary for two reasons. First, we must obtain financing and begin construction in July. A revenue bond approach cannot be done in this length of time, considering the lack of borrowing track record that Guam Solid Waste Authority has. By backing these bonds with the full faith and credit of the government, we can borrow at a far better rate, and currently the market is under 4%. We have the option of not going to the government obligation bond, but the borrowing rates will be worse, and we may force to increase the rates. In an ideal world, we would never have gone through receivership, and Guam Solid Waste Authority could borrow at rates by itself. But given the reality that we face, we have the obligation to make the best choice for our people and our ratepayers. When weighing the pros and cons, I believe we have enough borrowing capacity to take the government obligation bond route, ensure that our ratepayers are protected against fee increases. I greatly appreciate the questions about the PUC waiver because we are in partial receivership, and because this is a government obligation bond, because rates aren't impacted, there are valid questions as to whether the PUC should even play a role in borrowing. The court has suggested the PUC also concurs with this waiver. I admit that on initial review, the waiver gave me pause, but I am comforted knowing the process has had more review by the courts, by the governor's fiscal team, by the legislature, than any normal borrowing. This isn't simply Guam Solid Waste Authority running out and borrowing funds. The impact on our ratepayers has been the highest priority in discussions, and consequently, the proposal in this bill won't raise rates. Also, as a crucial consideration, the PUC review process takes 30 to 45 days. We simply don't have the luxury of time to avoid an environmental catastrophe and corresponding raising of rates. We must include the waiver language. I should note the PUC is aware of these tight construction timelines. They are unavailable to join us, but relate that we are good leaving it to the discretion of the legislature, and they frankly won't be upset either way. If needed, I encourage my colleagues to reach out to them to confirm. In the past, GovGuam was unable to make these difficult decisions about solid waste services. We did abdicate our responsibilities, resulting in a decade-long, painful receivership. Today, we are at a crossroads where we can seek to support a fledgling Guam Solid Waste Authority, and especially now with our landfill almost to capacity. If we fail to finance the expansion, we may end up with an environmental disaster and also return to full receivership. Or we can pass this bill and properly finance it and take back ownership of this critical public utility. You know, borrowing is never easy, but for capital improvement projects, it is the prudent course of action. Our people elected us to make tough decisions, and this bill before us provides a path. I want to thank my 8 co-sponsoring senators for their bipartisan support and the committee for addressing the bill today, and I thank my remaining colleagues who I hope will support this measure. I would like to thank the governor and the fiscal team, the Guam Solid Waste Authority, GITA, Department of Administration, BBMR, US EPA, Guam EPA, the receiver, respective legal representatives, the Office of the Attorney General of Guam, for their collaborative efforts in crafting this plan. Ultimately, this bill is about responsibility. Are we willing to make the strong decisions needed to take back control of our solid waste services? Will we support Guam Solid Waste as they get out of receivership? This is an opportunity that did not exist before, and now it does. I ask my colleagues for their support on Bill 79-35. Let's end the receivership. Let's protect our ratepayers and our environment. Let's take back our landfill. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to rise out from the Committee of the Whole with a recommendation to pass Bill 79-35.
My colleagues, there is a motion to rise from the Committee of the Whole with a recommendation to pass. Are there any objection? There being none, motion is carried. We are now in recess.
Y 35 na legislatura in Guam is back from recess. Senator Sabina Perez, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to report back to the body that Bill number 79-35, as amended by the Committee on General Government Operations, Appropriations, and Housing, with a recommendation to do pass, and I move to place on the third reading file.
On that motion, without any objections, motion carries. Vice Speaker Nelson, Majority Leader, you are recognized for recess to 10.
Jesus Masi, Madam Speaker, I make a motion to recess till tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.
Without any objections, No objections, motion carries. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Tomorrow at 10.